12:30. We got an hour. It's amazing. I hope this is interesting for an hour. We'll do our best, and also I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end. I mean, there's not many of us, so there should be plenty of availability to be able to take questions directly from you guys. And so let's just dive into the topic. I'll give you guys a little bit more context about who I am, tell you a little bit more about my story and why I'm speaking to the subject, and that way we can kind of engage. But ultimately, what we're aiming at is what Ian talked about, that we're going to talk about the partnership between worship and production. And this is, in many ways, one of my passion projects is helping bridge this gap, and because I believe it yields such important outcomes that are necessary in order to lead a church in worship effectively. So we'll get to that here in a second. Let me just again give you a little bit more about me. As I mentioned this morning, I grew up in Mexico City, Mexico. I'm a missionary kid. My dad's American, my mom's Mexican, and then when I was 18, I moved to the United States. I got my undergraduate degree in worship leadership at Liberty University out in Virginia. And then straight out of there, I moved to Chicago, where I worked at a church called Harvest Bible Chapel. I was part of starting a band called, at the time it was called Vertical Church Band. Then we ended up changing it and calling it Vertical Worship. Did that for 11 years. And then just 2 years ago, transitioned out here to Colorado. Now I work at New Life Church. But on the production side, I grew up in a small church. So in Mexico, if you were in worship, you were also in production. Those weren't two different places. You had to know everything. If you wanted to serve with electronic instruments, you had to be able to know the electronic side of it and the production stuff. And then when I got to college, I took a job as a full-time tech assistant. So the department was called Technical Productions. Basically, Liberty's a very large school, and so they would bring in all these tours from different places across the country. And so I would help set up, tear down, into awful hours of the night. And but I learned so much then, and that's where I started being a front of house engineer for the theater, and had experience there. So I've always been a nerd at heart, and I continue to be a nerd at heart. I 100% love all these things, will gladly geek out, and that's where, as I was writing the content for this, I was like, easy, Eddie, too far. Let's keep it a little bit more general. I was going too far into the details, so I will do my best. I'm going to share some detailed things, but I'm trying to hit that balance of just show you guys big picture what you need to be thinking about in some of these topics, but also giving you some details, but not bogging us down, because we could talk about anything for 1 hour, and that wouldn't take a lot of my effort to fill an hour on this topic. So that's my experience, and even now at New Life Church. Actually, at Harvest, my last church, I was the lead. I think the title was lead creative director. I can't even remember. Titles are so funny. Basically, what that meant was I was overseeing worship. It was a 7-campus church. I was overseeing worship for all 7 campuses. I was also overseeing creative and production for all campuses. So in that role, it was all one team. They all reported up to me as the department head of 3 departments. But then here at New Life, it's structured differently, where I oversee worship, but creative and production are on kind of the other side of the org chart. And so it's run very differently. But even after coming to New Life and taking the role as the worship department head, I have a very close relationship with the production manager, the production director, and I work very closely with the creative director. Why? Because you can slice it up however you want, but like I said this morning, we're ultimately all one team, which is we're in charge of what happens on the weekend on stage. Besides the preaching, everything else is us together. And that really matters to me. And so that's why this partnership has to exist. It doesn't have to exist, and I'm not going to give you the magic way of doing it. I don't think there is a magic way. I think the magic happens in relationships. And so what I'm going to encourage you is I'm going to give you some ideas on ways that we can partner, and we'll start big picture, leadership, structure, those kinds of things. Then we'll get into specifically maybe even instrument per instrument, some thoughts I have about if we look at a typical 5-piece band like what's on stage right now, some helpful things to be thinking about and conversations you could have. My goal for today would not be that you leave with all the answers, but rather you would be exposed to a world of asking different questions. That would be my goal for today. So again, don't feel overwhelmed. You don't have to master anything today, but maybe today's a thing where you can start taking some notes of I have no idea what we're talking about right now, but I feel like I'd like to explore that. And that would be great for me. I'm happy to, again, answer any questions that we have time for at the end. Sound like a plan? Good? All right, awesome. here we go. We're talking about the partnership between worship and production. Like I said, they're one team. They're not two teams, but for the sake of today, I'm gonna split those things up. Worship refers to the worship leaders and the instrumentalists who are on stage. They tend to be in charge of the planning of the service. Again, this is broad strokes. I'm just saying most likely they're in charge of planning of the service, the worship set itself, and production as the execution of all the technology involved in order to present a 5-piece band that's a hybrid electronic. We'll get to some of these things here in a second. And it's I want to start with this. I've told you guys where I've worked in the past, but I've also had the privilege of doing workshops like this across the country when I was traveling with Vertical Worship. We were touring, and we would always do these workshops, and it was awesome. Like, the workshops sometimes had just as many people as the night of worship, because these things just don't get talked about in a lot of places. There's a hunger for it. And during those times, here's what I've found, and this is fully anecdotal, this is not scientific, but I've found two things to be generally true about worship and production. One, worship teams can or tend to be a bit elusive. Here's what I mean by that. There's frustration in the tension between these two teams because people who are drawn towards technology and production are people who know how to follow rules. They understand the math, the equations. These are the engineer-minded people of the world. And those people need structure to exist. Like, that's part of their psyche. It's part of their DNA. They need that structure. And worship teams are like the opposite. The structure crushes some of the things that they're very good at. And so in a weakness, and as a strength, they bring creativity. As a weakness, they can be a bit elusive, which creates a tension because it's like, okay, we're willing to do the work to pull off whatever we need to do in the service, but we can't even get you guys like in the room, or we can't get you to answer emails. We can't get you to like just be like employees of an organization. There's, again, generalizations, but for the sake of conversation, I think it's helpful. They can be elusive. And on the flip side, I've seen that production teams can be, often they'll overcorrect in the way that they bring structure. And so because there's kind of like this tension between the two, the creative, the structure, the entrepreneurial, the systematic, whatever terms you want to use, we all live in that tension anyways. But if your team's very highly creative, doesn't like the structure, they have to take a step towards the structure. And in the same way, those who are structured have to take a step towards ambiguity. That's how you start building a partnership. The answer is not make everyone else who's different in the world like you. The answer is find ways to take steps towards each other. And so this is where worship and production teams end up kind of at odds, is you both feel the weight of what the weekend service brings. And it's weighty, guys. And Sunday always seems to come up every single weekend. Like, we just can't skip a Sunday. Like, it's always coming. There's always another service we're thinking about. And that weight starts to wear on people. And that's why we cannot afford to have tension between our teams, because you're not going to make it. I told someone yesterday, I was talking about the leadership team that I serve on and how much I appreciate the people I serve with. And I told them, I said, I am willing to walk out on any battlefield if I'm linked arms with you. So many things in ministry that are destroying us don't have to do with how bad the battlefield was. It has to do with how you feel about the people next to you. And this is what I'm passionate about. I am convinced that there are so many of our churches that we're missing out on what could be happening in our service simply because we're not trying to link arms. We're trying to check our box of our job description, and we're missing out on the ministry of the unity of the Spirit. That's the end game, is we want to present unity and say, let's bridge the gap. Okay, so let's accept these generalizations. Maybe they're true at your church, maybe they're not. It's totally fine if they're not. The point is, the partnership is what we're aiming for. All these tensions lead to isolating those departments. So many churches, when there's tension, the solution tends to be, well, then just go your separate ways. We won't make you overlap. We'll just make sure you guys are never in a room together. And I'm trying to say here, I don't think that's the best move. Isolating them will only lead towards less partnership. And you might say, hey, we're not arguing. Well, what if the argument brings a topic on the table that should be on the table? We shouldn't be conflict averse as leaders. My senior pastor often says leadership is conflict, and I agree with that definition. If you want to lead something, you have to get really comfortable with conflict and providing safe places for people to express why they experience the tension, the pressures that they're experiencing, and then coming up with solutions, ways forward. That's what we're after. And if we can fight for that as worship and production teams, it will show up in the service. And I can give you guys testimony of that. It will show up in the service. It's you're the two teams that are ushering into the space of worship. And if unity's not there, how do we expect it to exist between the congregation and the teams? It has to start here. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is leadership structure. I already mentioned that I've experienced multiple different organizational structure, and many of you, if you come from smaller churches, you're like, well, I mean, it's me. Like, the structure is I run it. I report to the pastor, and that's it, and that's totally fine. I grew up in a church of 250 people in Mexico, and that was very much the structure. It was like Eddie's in charge of anything that has anything to do with the stage besides the preaching. And if that's you, that's great. This might not apply as much, but for those of you who have larger teams and you're trying to figure out, I will just reiterate what I've already said. You have to find a way to build relationships and to have enough communication in order to partner. You don't have to report. You can put the department wherever you want, reporting to whoever you want, if the communication is adequate and the relationships are being built. That's what I always saw. When church calls me and say, hey, we just had this like kind of blow up between our teams. Someone called me a few months ago now, but they were talking about this topic, and I said, well, do you guys ever meet, ever? He's like, no. I was like, do you ever hang out? Is there any relationships between the two teams? No. It's a big church, and so they kind of all do their thing isolated. And I said, well, how in the world are we going to take steps forward if we don't even see each other? And so you have to have some sort of structure inside the leadership of understanding, yes, where does the buck stop? Who is reporting to who? Those are important questions. But however you structure it, make sure that the communication between the teams is possible and the relationships can be formed. Every time I'm leading a big event like Easter service or Christmas Eve, I make it a point to make sure that the teams are celebrating each other. So when I'm talking to the worship teams, I say, you guys walk up to the production team and you be the person to thank them. And you be the person to voice it. They're doing things behind the scenes that no one else sees but us. You make sure you're saying that. And then when I'm talking with the production teams, I say, hey guys, it took so much work for us to piece this ensemble together, to write the music. And they also express gratitude towards the worship team, saying, we're so thankful for what you bring in the heart of worship and all these things. That's what I want. Regardless of who's reporting to who, I want that happening inside the church I'm serving at. And so I would encourage people, find a way to make the communication happen. Even if your departments don't work together, there might just be a 30-minute meeting you could consider having where you do a weekly review and a weekly preview. And it doesn't have to be in-depth. You don't have to go into solving frustrations. If it could just be a Zoom-out meeting of saying, here's what just happened. Anybody have any thoughts? Some awesome stories from the weekend. Make sure we're celebrating each other. It gives a space, like what I said, for the teams to celebrate what the other does. And then also you look into what's coming next so that the communication is present. So even if you didn't develop the service together, at least we're having a few minutes every week. We're saying, we agree that this is going to happen on Sunday. These songs, this band, this ensemble, the expectations are clear. So many times the tension between the teams is just like, we are not communicating, and we show up on Sunday and everyone's frustrated. There's the people who wanted something that wasn't there is frustrated. The person who was in charge of setting up that specific setup with microphones is not there. They're frustrated because they didn't do their job. It's frustration left and right. And that's why a weekly meeting I found to be extremely helpful. Also, like I said, you can put it under one person. You can put it under multiple, but I'm just leaving it to you guys. Figure out the ways to create an environment of partnership. Okay, so that's leadership structure. That's just however your church is structured. It doesn't even have to be staff. Even if it's run by people who are volunteering, like I grew up in churches volunteering, the structure still matters. Who is in charge of what really, really matters, because you cannot implement a philosophy of ministry if you don't have the leaders to implement it. And I also talk to churches where it's like, man, the philosophy is really strong, but who's in charge is so vague and not helpful that we end up frustrated and we end up fighting about small things. It's because we don't have an understanding of who exactly is calling what in what specific scenario. So leadership structure leads the way. Then we get to philosophical alignment. Now, this is where leaders must agree on what the philosophy of the weekend service is. Man, we skip this so often in churches. Like, we just jump in and we assume we all agree on the purpose of the service. Did you know that there's great variety, turns out, in this topic? So some questions to maybe ask each other as leaders is, what's the purpose of the gathering? If we're gathering on Sundays every single week, why do we think that's worth our time? What's the purpose of it? And what's the win of the gathering? And you start realizing there's many things involved in what it could be. For some, they're going to focus more on encountering the presence of God. For others, it's going to be about discipleship and that you grow as a Christian in the weekend experience. Or for others, it's going to be that it's about it's missional focus, and it's you come, yes, but it's all about sending you out. And here's the thing, hopefully we can do all three of those. And I think the churches that are seeing a lot of success are the ones that try to balance all three of those things. And by success, I don't mean numbers of people in the room. I mean healthy teams. That's success for me. Healthy teams. If the church is 20 people, what I care more about is, are we healthy? Are we loving one another well? And so the healthy churches, I see them that they value the presence of God, and they have an understanding that God does move in our times of worship. They haven't just removed the presence of God from it because God's everywhere. And yes, that's true, but God's not everywhere in the same way. I don't believe that. I don't believe the scriptures teach that. There's a presence of God. If God's everywhere in the same way, then why would he say, draw near to me and I'll draw near to you? The nearness of God, what does it mean? He's already right next to me, but why is he saying I'll draw near to you? That is in reference to the way that God is present. And that's what we're after on the weekend. So you have to explore these topics as worship and production teams. If you can't answer the question, our value set for this Sunday is that this happened, then you have no chance that the team members would be able to answer that question. The leaders have to be able to answer the question, what is the purpose of the gathering? What's the bullseye of the worship set? That's another really important question. Why are we singing? And what's the end game of our singing? I come from a philosophy of ministry that the end game of worship is singing to God about God. That we're not going to end in the ultimate place being sharing our testimony and trying to encourage one another about how difficult our life is, but finding our comfort in God. There's a place for that in worship. I'm just saying the philosophy of the ministries I've led has to do with, I want that. I want testimony. I want to gather God's people, but I want to get to the place where we're in the presence of God and we start singing to God directly. That's called ascription. And that is a big value of mine. And so all the ministries that I've been involved in leading, that is central to it. And so we agree, we're saying the purpose of it is this. We're going to get people into the space of ascription. Again, I'm not going to show you a Bible verse that says you have to make that the center of the worship set. I'm just saying that's the choice I made. But what I am saying is you should have something that's the center, something that's the bullseye, something you guys are working together to aim the worship set, the worship experience towards. If you have lighting, if you have video, what's the purpose of it? I've talked with churches where they spend large amount of money on a lighting package. They install it, and then they find themselves kind of twiddling their thumbs, like, wait, why did we do this? What's the purpose? Is it just to have lights? Like, what's the goal here again? And again, I would just encourage you, answer those questions as leaders and put words around it, put vocabulary around it, because if it's not articulated and written, it is not believed by a group of people. Okay? You can have the thoughts. You might be able to answer that question, but if it's not written down and someone else on your team can articulate it, ultimately you have not led your team into that place. And what I find is so many people, I see this a lot with lighting departments or lighting directors. It's like they're kind of the stepchild. It's like we have a clear sense of purpose on the audio side, and we have a clear sense of purpose of the video. We're trying to, using iMac to be able to communicate in the rooms that we're in. But then lighting is like, and we have lights to have lights. Like, that's not helpful. Like, I'm not going to give my life to something like that. A job description just has no purpose. And so the job of, again, worship and production, we have to be able to present a philosophical position, which I'm not going to give you today. I'm going to ask you, develop one. Have a purpose for any kind of production, any method that you're using inside of ministry. Have it agreed upon. And once you have that agreement between the teams, you will be amazed how much easier it gets to lead the teams into unity. The disunity comes from we have philosophical disagreements, but we just don't know where to go with them. So much gets solved by just saying, as leaders, we have agreed. This is the purpose. This is why you're here. Would you like to be a part of this team for this purpose? And then people can decide, actually, I don't like that purpose. I don't want to be a part of your team. Great. I would like to be a part of the team. Great. Now they're already set up to succeed because we've communicated the philosophical position of the teams. Okay? So that's the next thing, leadership structure, then philosophical alignment. Then third thing is healthy relationships. Healthy relationships. This is where, of the churches I've worked at, the smaller ones, because it's smaller, we had more space to grow in relationship. And then I started working at churches that were so large, where if I didn't do something intentionally, I could just not see someone for a long time that I'm technically working with every single weekend. They could be in the booth on every single weekend. I'm on stage, and I could just not have a conversation with them for years if I let it happen. It required a level of intentionality the larger the church I was working at. And this is why relationships have to be valued. You have to say, this is one of our philosophical positions, that we want to serve God next to people, and we want to feel like we're people. And we want to feel like they know that I'm just a person and they're a person. That happens through relationships. One of the things that happened in one of my jobs, I was overseeing production. I had the production director come to me, and he walked in my office. He was kind of quiet. I was like, ooh, I don't know. Are you about to quit? Like, what's about to happen here? And he sat down and he was like, hey, I just want to bring up something to your attention. And I was like, yeah, what is it? And he was like, hey, I really enjoy spending time with you, but your humor many times is sarcastic at my expense. And when you do that, when you use humor with sarcasm, I don't feel like I value to you. I'm someone who you value. And so like in that moment, I just looked straight at him and I said, I own it. I said, you're right. And I'm sorry that my idea of just being fun and funny has hurt you. And I thanked him for even bringing it up, because what he did in that meeting was he gave me something that so few leaders do. He was truly honest about the way my actions had affected him, and he came to me. That was such a gift. Like so many of us in church, it's like once the hurt happens, you go everywhere else to talk about it except for the person who hurt you. And that was such a gift. So I wanted to be very clear, thank you. And then I made conscious choices from there to commit to say, hey, I will not do that anymore. You will not receive that humor from me anymore. I don't want to hurt anything. And the reason that matters is because it made our relationship stronger. And we served the Lord for many years together and did so many incredible things together. And a lot of that came from the health of knowing he can tell me if something's up, and I can tell him if something's going on. We have to fight for healthy relationships. And so in order to foster that, we have to find ways that the members of our team can interact with each other occasionally. If it's not weekly, maybe consider, like, does the Christmas party need to be just this team? Could it be opened up to more teams? Could a once a year thing, picnic in the summer, could it be opened up? Like, just brainstorm and think about those things. What are the places where we're fostering, developing relationships between production and worship? And again, there's many ways to do it. Just pick one and find ways to celebrate each other. Find ways to celebrate each other. Find ways to be thankful for one another. Anytime you experience disunity, and when I've walked into places and I feel that tension, I always try to get towards thankfulness. Hey, tell me what's great. Tell me what you're thankful for. Why are you serving here? Why not somewhere else? Tell me about the story of how you got here. Why'd you make the choice to be on this team and not a different team? All those things lead towards the things that why we got in ministry in the first place. Why we're serving here is because I love this and I'm so thankful for these moments. I've been marked by this. I've been marked by that. All those things help us get back to the heart of being able to build relationships and work together. All right, so leadership structure, philosophical alignment, healthy relationships, and then finally this, and this is where I'll spend the rest of my time. Then when you have those three things, and only when you've spent time on those three things, then I think we pursue musical excellence together. Now we get to the end game of saying this is the outcome we want. We want to be producing and pursuing musical excellence together because we need each other in order to do that. Now, why do we want musical excellence? Because God calls for it. He says, sing it to the Lord a new song, and then he says, play skillfully. God wants us to not just be phoning it in when it comes to leading people musically. If we're going to use instruments, we should play them as best as we can. If we're going to use a console, if we're going to use video, lighting, all these things, we should be good at it. We should work to get good at our craft so that we're doing this skillfully. And if we're committed to that together, not as some cultural standard, well, we have to have all this gear because that's what churches are doing these days. If that's the philosophical driver, you're going to run out of steam real fast. That is not something that keeps you going when things get hard. But instead, it's part of my worship is I just want to bring to God the best thing I can bring and get better at it and grow in skills. And so what's shifted so much in the last century is that the partnership between the technology and the musician has now blurred lines. And I'll get to that here specifically. It used to be that the musician was fully in charge of delivering the skill set, and then we lived in acoustic environments, not electronic environments. When you have a concert venue where you have no microphones, it doesn't matter what the production team, there is no production team, because the instrument itself is producing the end result. But that's been a massive shift now with technology, and as we're using these devices to amplify our sound, now that process becomes super important to be a partner, and that's why we have to be viewing this as one team. So this isn't me giving anyone permission to blame someone else. It's bringing up questions that leaders should consider in order to increase the quality of the live music that we produce every single weekend. That's what we're doing. Now, just in basic terms, we've already said, okay, we're committed to the ministry. This is what we're doing. Now I'm going to speak in very practical terms of what we're doing. What exactly are we doing? We are producing a live music experience every single weekend. And so we want to learn, how do we do that exactly? While I was in Chicago, the 11 years I was there, one of the things I did is I got my master's in film scoring at Columbia College there in Chicago. And kind of feels like, wait, what are you? Like, do you preach? Do you do worship? And for me, it's like, it's all the same thing in my mind. I'll do anything at church to continue the mission that Jesus gave us. And when I got my film scoring degree, we talked a lot about, so I'm a composer. I'll write music for short films and kind of things that I've written in the past, specifically for the screen. And when you're the composer, you're using a computer, and sometimes you'll use real instruments, but especially small budget stuff, you're all in the box. That means you're just doing the whole thing inside of the computer. And it stood out to me. One of the things that stuck to me was, like, in the first few weeks of that program, the program director, he was like teaching us. We were talking about principles of film scoring, and he just looks at us and he goes, "Hey guys, just start here. You have to understand this. What you're doing is you are producing electronic music. You're producing electronic music." And I remember sitting there, and when I first heard that, I was like, "What are you talking about? Like EDM? Like I'm not producing electronic music." And he's like, no. What I mean is, nothing else matters besides what comes out of the speakers. And this is a change. This is a cultural change in music, in the world of music. And a lot of times we feel the tension, because if you can't accept that that's the reality you live in, you're going to have a really hard time making the changes and adjustments I'm about to bring up. I start from the premise that what we're producing every single weekend, because it's coming out of speakers wherever they are, somewhere up there, is electronic music, okay? At its core, it's an electronic medium. The only thing that matters as far as the final product is what's coming out of the speakers, okay? So that becomes my new standard. Instead of my standard being how exactly does my instrument sound acoustically, my goal now becomes, it's not just my instrument, it's how my instrument ends up being heard in the room. Make sense? That becomes the win, and not my opinion about my acoustic experience. And so we enter into this space of electronic music, and that's why we have to agree on what the musical aim is for our church. A musical aim is so important, because music, there's all these different genres out there, there's all these different things that you might try to do, but guys, because it's an electronic medium, the approach is very different in every single genre. If we're trying to produce, I'm just gonna make something like a jazz worship service, the way you mix jazz is so different on drums than a rock drum kit that we have to make different choices along the way in order to produce the best electronic sounding through speakers jazz music that we can produce. And so that's why we have to have some sort of like, hey, here's what we're aiming for. So I always encourage production directors and worship directors to have this in agreement, and you just need to pick you can do them many ways. You can pick specific songs that you're like, that, if we could sound like that on Sunday, I think that would be great. Or like these 3 tracks, somewhere in this neighborhood would be great. Again, it doesn't mean you can never do anything else. It just means you have a home plate. Like you have a place you want to come back to, and it allows your teams to start honing their skills specifically towards the music that we're trying to generate. And this is where it's hard because you guys already heard me say today, like God doesn't give us the genre. So I'm not saying you have to be any genre. You can pick whatever genre you want. What I'm saying is understand how to produce that genre. Understand exactly what it means to make the instruments sound the way they're supposed to sound in that genre. What's so fascinating to me is inside any genre, you have multiple artists creating music in that space, and no one's telling them how to mix or master to sound like the genre. They just know that these tools lead towards these choices. That's fascinating to me. This is, again, me nerding out about stuff with you guys, but I just think it's so fascinating that no one tells them, like, I don't know anywhere where someone decided that, like, hip hop mixing sounds like this. Those things just happened organically because they found that the specific amount of tools led towards the desired result. And so artists have very similar mixing tools, very similar producing tools inside of a genre, and that happened organically. So in the same way in church, if we have some sort of sense of, hey, our genre musically is this, then we use those recordings and we say, that's our aim. Now we're all trying to work towards that aim. And it's going to take a lot of work to get there, and that's okay if it's going to take a lot of work, but at least we know what we're aiming at. Because so many times, if we're about to get to each instrument, and sometimes you have to have conversations like, what if we didn't do this and we did this? But when you go to an instrumentalist and you just say, hey, just change because, that's like a recipe for disaster. I try to never ask anyone to change anything without giving them the why we're changing. And so in the ministries I lead, I say, hey, here's kind of where we're aiming musically. Here's what we've agreed on. And so we're all going to do our part to make different choices to be able to produce that end result of the genre that we're trying to replicate in our live environment. So here are the 3 steps that we're going to approach to each instrument, 3 categories as we're considering how can we partner with production and worship. You always have to study that in order to produce excellent music, you have to have a high-quality source. That's number 1, high-quality source. Number 2, intentional processing. Intentional processing. Number 3, accurate amplification. Accurate amplification. Those are the 3 things within any instrument or voice that you need to consider. These are the categories, okay? So high-quality source. The source, I'm going to use this acoustic guitar as my example. High-quality source. The source refers to the make of that guitar. How does it sound without being plugged in? Does it sound okay? Does it sound awful? Do the frets buzz? Like, it doesn't matter how much other fancy things we have. If the source is broken, we can't make miracles happen after that. Okay, so high quality source. So if you're like, this is a way to identify the issues with anything you're frustrated with musical excellence. Where is it really the problem? Is it the source? Because I'm telling you, you don't need the most amazing sounding acoustic guitar in order to mix a great acoustic guitar in a worship service. It doesn't have to be the most expensive guitar, but it also can't be something you bought at Costco. Okay? And no, I'm not slamming Costco. If you bought your instrument at Costco, I'm just saying there's something in the mid-range that there's some basics that you need from the source. So if that's the source, next we move on to intentional processing. The processing starts at the electronic inside the instrument. So it seems like this one is one. I don't see a microphone in it, so it would maybe be a pickup. And so it's using a pickup. Now we start evaluating. What does this pickup yield? You cannot ask a pickup to do the job of a microphone and vice versa. So the processing starts with the pickup of the microphone, then it goes through a cable. The integrity of the cable also matters. The integrity of everything in the processing matters. Everything matters. And then, I have no idea what that is, but there's some sort of pedal processing something here. Then it goes through your signal path to a console. Now you have all the processing available that the console offers. Then from the console, we're outputting. Again, the cable goes through the amplifiers. Then there's processing that happens inside of the amplifiers that are going to change the way it comes out the speakers. That processing has to do with the room. It's more of like a general equalization of the room, addressing the problematic frequencies inside the room. So it's going to process the audio even more. And only after that, then finally we have true amplification of electricity gets sent to these speaker boxes, and it comes out as sound. That's the last step, which is how does it sound in the room? So you could have an amazing instrument, amazing processing, but if you don't have a good PA system that's well set up in the room, it doesn't yield a result. Why? Because it's electronic music. So you can get steps 1 and 2 just 10 out of 10, and step 3 is not good. If you're at a 2 out of 10, you have wasted all your energy because it's not going to yield anything better in the end. So that's where you have to prioritize and say, hey, we have all these things we want to improve, but honestly, we should put all our money, all our raising funds towards a better system. And I'm not saying you need a 10 out of 10 system, but you need to get to the place where your amplification, what's coming out of speakers, is accurate enough that you can deliver a high quality product, musically speaking. So those are the three things we're going to consider: source, processing, and amplification. All right, I'm sorry I'm saying so many words, but I'm trying to get through all this content fast enough so that we can get to some questions. All right, so let's talk about instruments now. I'm only going to go through the 5-piece band. Obviously, every instrument has its own set of things we need to consider. I do not have enough time to go through it. I'm not even going to talk about vocals, am I? No, I'm not. So I'm not going to talk about vocals. I'm literally just going to stick to the instruments. But again, my hope is that I'll expose you to a way of thinking about these things that you can apply them to anything that you have in your context in the room that you're serving in. Okay, so let's start with the most acoustic instrument in the band. The most acoustic instrument, most times, not always, depending on your context, is this instrument right here behind me. That's the most acoustic instrument. It makes more sound acoustically than any of the other instruments by quite a bit. The drum kit does. And so because it's an acoustic instrument, then we start with, remember how we're going to go through this, high quality source. So how do we assess the source of our acoustic instrument? Now, again, some of you guys may have no drums. Some of you guys may have electronic drums. I do not have enough time to dive into all those topics. Let's just start with the basic premise of we have an acoustic drum kit in the room. Okay, so in the world of the drums, the drum heads and the drum shells is what generates the tone, okay? So we're using a beater. Let's talk about the kick drum. The type of wood that it is makes a different sound. If it's this type of wood, it's going to sound different than this type of wood. So we study the tone, the size of the kick drum. All that makes a difference. Everything about the wood, the drum head that you're choosing, the brand, the way you have dampening mechanisms on it, like moon gels, all those things change the sound. And so we start by saying, how can we get a high quality source of a drum kit? And here's the good news, guys. You don't have to spend $1 bazillion to get a good drum kit anymore. I'm so thankful that, I just bought another drum kit. Like I said, I preach at young adults, and we bought our own drum kit for the room. And the room is about, I would say, half the size of this room. So it's not a huge room, maybe even less than half. And we bought our drum kit for $800 for all the shells. Now, it didn't include hardware and all that stuff, but in the world of drums, $800 is like, okay, well, that seems like possible now. Instead of what it used to be, if you wanted a high quality, you're talking $5,000+ to even get the shells. So thankfully, technology, and there's so many companies out there. So we bought a Barton kit, and we bought a 12, a 14-inch, and then a 20-inch kick. And I'm telling you guys, it's kind of a small kit, but it gives you everything you need in order to produce a high-quality drum sound in a smaller environment. So it's worth, you don't have to spend thousands, but do invest in something that can sound like a good drum kit without any microphones. That's important. So start there, because you can't make miracles out of a drum kit that just doesn't even sound like drums at the end of the day. Then you need to ask yourselves about the cymbals and the approach of the cymbals. So if the source of the cymbals is too bright, cymbals can be, in general, you're talking about bright, so higher frequency cymbals, and then there's darker ones, lower frequencies. And what's very common, especially in the genres I work in the churches I work in, dark cymbals is the approach now, and that's because we have so many other things in the upper register that the cymbals being a little darker makes them more manageable, and tools that we can use and say, hey, it doesn't have to just completely destroy our lead vocal when we have a cymbal hit. So we're considering what's the quality of cymbals. And I would say, personally, if I had money to pick, am I going to spend it on the shells, the snare, or the cymbals, I would put it in the cymbals. That's totally preference. But that's the part that even if you have, this is a hybrid system, because you guys, this morning, we heard the drum kit physically and we heard the drum kit electronically. And because it's that hybrid environment, that's why the cymbals become so important. Because if we process the drum shells well, and the snare and the kick and the toms, all that happen, you're actually hearing mostly the electronic version of that, which is the process signal. You're not hearing as much of the acoustic. But in the cymbals, It doesn't matter if there's no drum shield and fully covered, you are hearing the actual cymbals in the room. And so that's why I think if you're going to spend money on only one of the categories, I recommend starting there because it's going to yield the best results out of all the things. Because I get it, we don't all have just infinite budgets. We're all limited in one way or another. So you got to make some choices. So that's why I recommend that. Then if we're talking about the source, we also got to talk about the player. Is the dynamic range of the musician too wide? Here's what I mean by that. With drummers specifically, the volume range, dynamic range is not 0 to 10. And if you think it's 0 to 10, you're not going to be able to be processed the right way. They're going to have to do too many things in the processing because you are not offering what we need. What we need is something a little bit more like from 5 to 9. Like if you're playing, you're hitting it at an intensity that's more of like a light switch instead of a fader. This is a different mentality that drummers have to go through, again, depending on their background. If they grew up inside of jazz drumming, the dynamic range inside of jazz drumming is 0 to 10. There are things that jazz drummers do that are so quiet, but they're a lot of times in acoustic environments where you can hear that little bit of detail. In a live electronic environment, you cannot hear that amount of detail, and so you have to dynamically already start at a 5 so that it can be heard, and then get your loudest at 9. I just say 9 so that you don't just hit it as hard as you possibly can, because then the tone starts to shift. So dynamic range is something to consider, and then you got to work to make your drums sound like the musical aim that is agreed upon. This is where it's most helpful. You have a musical aim, listen to the track that you say, hey, this is what we're aiming for, and ask yourself, what does the kick sound like? And I mean detailed, exactly, how can we get closer to that frequency range that kick sounds like versus in other genres, there are many genres like metal. You think of metal music, the kick drum is mostly the beater, so it's a high frequency thing. It has almost no thump. Because if you had a thump in metal music, you'd have it'd be way too much low end. And so you just have to consider the genre you're in and say how big, how much low frequency can the kick have in this genre? Asking all those questions so that you're comparing it to the musical aim, and then you have to have whoever's at the console make sure they have the tools, and specifically about mixing live drums. That's a whole thing that I tell people, if you can get the drums right, you already made it. I honestly believe this, okay? So if you can get the drums right, even if you're not awesome at vocals and all the other instruments, you're gonna get something good enough that it'll work. The drums in the mix are so important. Again, why? In the genres I'm working with, the drums are right behind the vocals. It's like vocals, then drums, then bass, and then everybody else. And so because they're so forefront in the mix, in the genre that I'm using, they matter that much also. And it's also the hardest position on our team to join because we expect so much from our drummers. They hold so much influence. And so, yeah, that's where you have to know the live mixing techniques, equalization, EQ, compression, reverb, and bus compression. If you can just get the basics in those categories, you would be amazed, if you really understand the basics, how much you can produce. Sadly, guys, because we live in the age of plugins, of just there is an infinite amount of things I could start listing off here of hey, there's this tool we use and this tool we use and Waves this and Slate drums that, and there's so much out there. It's so overwhelming. But one of the things that's happened is I think people are skipping the basics of audio production and trying to find the secret sauce in a plugin. And really what you need to do is you need to understand exactly what EQ does and the techniques you use it on drums. You need to understand exactly what kind of compressors you're using and the way that you're going to use it on the kit. Reverb, bus compression, and trying to master the basics will yield so many better results than mastering those kind of fancy last step plugins that I think a lot of people, often when I do workshops, they're hey, what do you use on this? And what's your plugin for that? I'm just I can tell you that, but that's not going to yield a result. The result comes from mastering the basics of live production. So then once you master the basics, then a topic that is very much on the forefront is this idea of triggers. A trigger is where you use the microphone on the drum to literally trigger a previously recorded sample of that drum hit, and then you're layering that on top of the live version of the drum hit. Make sense? So you're having multiple snare hits when really in the room there's only one snare. The hitting of the snare triggers inside of the processing multiple snares being heard. So that is the answer if you're wondering why do our live drums sound so different than the studio drums? It's because I would have bet if you're listening to a studio drum kit, most likely they are using triggers. And so it's not just one snare, it's 4. It's not just one tom, it's 3. It's not just one kick, it's 2. Like it's all these different layers that you're adding in, mixing them in so that it becomes a hybrid instrument. You're hearing the playing, so I'm not saying they become like obsolete. The player matters so much. But then you can also support it with these samples to beef up again, that also lowers your dynamic range and it helps the drummer stay in that 5 to 9 range dynamically. Now triggers again are very controversial because to some drummers that's like fake. I grew up, my primary instrument is a keyboard. So like, that's like me saying I will only play an acoustic grand piano for church and like, that's it. That's going to limit so much of what I'm going to do. That's why for me, I was like very comfortable. I was like keyboards, synths, organs, like I just dove into it, was very excited. In the same way, I think the drummers that say, hey, let's try it. Like we don't have to do it forever, but let's explore these spaces because maybe that'll help us hit our musical aim more. Okay? So that's it. There's multiple ways of triggering. You can do it with a physical trigger. Roland has multiple physical triggers you can buy and you load the sample onto the device, you put it on the drum, and then it'll trigger, and then you just have an extra channel in your snake that you're sending to trigger, or you can do it digitally. That's how I've done it in the past. I have the plug-in inside a laptop, which is in the booth. The drum microphone goes to the laptop triggers, and then goes into the console, and then that ends up through the speakers. So triggering is something, it's very curious, it's worth exploring. I use it in our smaller environments more than I use it in the big environments, because in the big environments, you can be a lot louder. In the smaller environments, we're trying to contain the sound of the drums, and the triggers allow us to do that in a much more efficient manner. So then we get to bass, and I'm going to kind of blaze through these for time. Bass, again, start with the source. I always recommend kind of like basic, if you're starting with the standards of like an American Fender P bass or a jazz bass, American standard. Actually, there's some Squires that even sound awesome now. So you do not have to throw a ton of money, but you do need to somewhere get in the mid-range. Start at the mid-range because we can't make miracles with these beginner basses. Then I also encourage people to look into Sans amp. A Sans amp is an amp modeler. It models, in a small little pedal like this, it models what an amp head and speaker cabinet do, and it does it pretty accurately. And when I've toured on a bass rig, I've played arenas, and all I had was a bass and a Sans amp, and it worked out great. You don't have to have a ton of stuff, especially with bass. And then all you need is like a tuner or maybe a compressor on your pedal board. I do not recommend multi-effects. I don't recommend all these different things with bass. Bass is, again, in the lower frequencies, we want simple, very, very high quality processing. Sans amp allows us to do that. And less is more with bass anyways, right? Consistent playing, landing all the right chords is so much more important to me than if you can play the fill that was on some recording. I'm always like, give me the bass player who doesn't miss the chord ever. That's my favorite bass player because it's such an important, you're the foundational note. If you're on the wrong note, turns out the rest of the band is on the wrong note too, is how it works sonically. If the foundational pitch is wrong, everything else suddenly became wrong. But if you have the right foundational pitch, even if on keyboard, if I sometimes like slip and hit a wrong note, most times you won't notice that I did that. Whereas in bass world, you always notice. It's what invites the awkward turtle, into the worship center. That's what I would say when the bass is not there. So then you're mixing, and as you get to the processing, you're considering where the kick drum and the bass are interacting. So there needs to be space so that the attack of the kick can hit in the room exactly how we want, and then the bass is audible. It's as if the bass is the tonal extension of the kick drum. And so when you start mixing, you start using tips, and there's many different ways of doing it. You can use dynamic EQ, you can use sidechain processing, all to create a little bit of space so that when the kick hits, it's audible, and then the bass is heard after that. Then we move on to the electric guitar. Let me say this, the electric guitar is the most expensive instrument to play at a church. By a long shot. And here's why. Most times the church is going to provide the drum kit, it's going to provide the keyboard, at least that's what we do. But in the electric world, I do not provide a pedal board. And I don't even provide the guitar. So it is the most most expensive way to join our team is to say, I want to play electric guitar. And that's because of those pedals. And here's a great example of the processing is the sound now. You can be an amazing electric guitar player, but if you're not mastering the processing of the sound, it's almost as if you're playing two instruments simultaneously. That's how you have to view it. And the processing of the electric guitar sound is almost another band member. And this is why you have to start with the basics. Again, master the basics. Master your understanding of overdrive, delay, and reverb. If you can master those three things, you can deliver on the like typical worship sound. If you can master those three things, you don't need $1 bazillion. You need 3 pedals, and you need a decent guitar, and you can start providing some of the things that you are used a lot in worship. So you have to master that, and then I'm a big fan of them being in stereo, even if the room isn't stereo. So I don't know, this might be a mono room, but in the processing, if your electric guitarist is using delay and reverb, stereo is a part of that sound. And so if you still have to tackle how the summing happens in the room, that's in the accurate amplification topic. But in the processing side, I still like keeping it stereo, even if just in their ears it's stereo, but then we have a way to sum it to be mono in the end. And I still think that's a win because it's way more inspiring. You can't remove one of the main tools in order to generate that sound is that it's a stereo space, sonic space. Then amps obviously are most ideal if you have amps, and those affect the tone drastically. There's nothing like the sound of a tube breaking, the way that happens specifically. That is not something, their pedals are getting better and better at it, and some of the pedals are blowing my mind. I have an amp modeler pedal. It's an ACS1, and I'm freaking out about how good it sounds. Again, I'm still going to pick amps over the pedal, but in small environments, there's many places where I'm like, you don't need to worry about amps, just buy one of these. That's made by Walrus Audio. Strymon also makes a pedal called Iridium, and it allows you to have stereo signal for an electric guitar without any amps in the room, adding audio to the room. Then we get to the keys player, and this is, the keys player is the most overplayed instrument in the band, in my opinion, because if you grew up like I did as a keys player in church where there wasn't a band, you were the band. So you have this skill set of filling all the frequency and doing everything on the keyboard. And when you have a band, you have to make conscious choices to say, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. If the bass player is doing the bass part, well, then I don't have to do the bass part anymore. Instead, I support the bass part. On the large sections, I'll put a low octave, and that's about it. Everything else, I'm staying mid-range. Then I'm listening to the electric player. I'm interplaying with them. And so, again, keys, especially keys, my goodness. The keyboard, any keyboard is outputting in stereo. Why? Because they're mimicking you sitting at a piano, and when you sit at a piano, you have 2 ears listening. And so on your left ear, the low end's louder than on the right, than on the high end, and vice versa on the right ear. So this is why you need 2 channels for keyboards. One of the hardest things is people want to have that like cool pad piano thing, and they come to me and I'm like, yeah, but you're in mono. Like, that's one of the main limiting things is you're not allowing the space to exist. So we can't explore reverb and pads and synthesizers and all this stuff because there's no point. It's all squashed down and summed anyways. So we need to figure out ways to make sure that we're still allowing the source to sound the way it should. You can buy expensive keyboards. I play Nord keyboards, which are those red ones that are $1 bazillion, and there's some advantages to having those. But guys, you can also do this completely in the box. I've played many services with just a MIDI controller and doing it all through MainStage, and it did not cost a lot of money to build that rig. It's still somewhere in the range of like $500 to do it all electronically. These keyboards are thousands of dollars. It's like $4,000 for a Nord Stage. Well, the 4 is like $5,000 now. I just saw yesterday. So, but again, know what you have, and then you can do it completely in the box or through a keyboard. But if you have a keyboard that was created in 1990, the techniques used to generate those sounds are your limitation. Your keyboard can play all the right parts, but it's just never going to sound that way because you don't have the same techniques that we have available to us in 2023. So consider the source. Then there's not a lot of things we have to do on the processing. But then we get to our mixing approach, and this is the last thing I'll say is once we have all our sources kind of having a conversation, we're asking these questions. How can we make it sound better as a source? How can we process this better, and how can we amplify it better? If we approach that, then our mixing technique becomes about hearing all the things we've worked on. The best mixing start from the understanding of like my job as a mixer is I'm trying to make sure anything you see, you can hear. And so many times we're trying to use our mixing technique to hide weaknesses. You really shouldn't be hiding weaknesses. You have to let it be what it is, and then it exposes, hey, the source is the problem. Great, let's have the conversation. How can we improve the source? And then you can have conversations about that. Ultimately, you're studying it, you're asking questions. That's what I said, guys. Like, don't feel like listening to this workshop is going to yield all the results you want. My point is this: partner as ministries and ask all these questions and so much more, but find ways to do it in healthy relationship where you're agreeing in philosophy of ministry. And it is one of the most fun things I've gotten to do in my career is taking steps forward in musical excellence when all those other things are in place. Okay? So that's it. Leadership structure, philosophical alignment, and then building relationships, and then pursuing musical excellence together. That's how I've found over the years being able to partner between worship and production has been a value for me, and I hope it's a value for you moving forward. We have just a couple minutes here. Thankfully it's not a ton of people here, so if anybody has a question, do you want to raise your hand? I'd be happy to take questions. Anybody? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the question would be maybe along like the musical excellence side of things. So how would you maybe handle a situation where, so an ideal world, as you're bringing musicians on, you have the opportunity to sit down with them one-on-one, talk through philosophy of ministry, musical expectations. But what do you do in a situation where maybe you inherit some musicians and now you're working through some of that musical excellence, specifically just as an example, keyboard player, amazing heart, character, they love the Lord, but maybe used to that situation that you mentioned earlier where they're used to just
playing everything.
And you're gently trying to lead them into, hey, like here's kind of the goal of where we're heading in terms of music, genre, worship music as a whole, as a genre is so different.
Right.
So what are some like tips or just some ways to kind of help lead them into
That's great.
some of that?
So the question is, if you inherited people who came from a different background and even inside of the church, and they're kind of doing what was the win, and now we're about to get bombed or something, it's like so loud. So the question is, what if you inherit those players? Well, I've always inherited that, just so you know. Unless you plant the church, and even when you plant, like all my friends who have planted, you still most times are starting with teams who were serving somewhere else and then joined your plant. So we're all inheriting that every single time we take a leadership position. And this is where the relational side becomes so important. So I always coach worship pastors, worship leaders. If you're stepping into a situation where you're the new one and the people are not new, you wait, okay? I always recommend 12 months before you make any significant changes. 12 months of what? Just sitting there and waiting for the day where I get to change something? No, 12 months of building relationships. If you're called to the ministry, the people are the ministry. They're not the thing in the way of the ministry, they are the ministry. And so spend 12 months building relationships. If there is a mutually trusting relationship that exists prior to the presentation of a philosophy, your chances of success just go that much higher. So it's build relationships, trust, love, care, affection, all the things we know to do with building relationships. Then I present it in a what we're aiming to do, not in a what I don't want you to do. You position it positively. The job of the leader is to always maintain a positivity inside the group. We can't be the bearers of bad news all the time. So you present and say, we're aiming for this, like what you talked about. We're aiming for this, and here's why we're aiming for this. I believe that if we take steps towards this musically, what that allows is for our church to have easy on-ramps into this genre of music. It's not more holy music. It's easier. It's more effective in our context here in the city that we're in. And I believe it is. And I think it yields results. And then they start feeling like, I'm a part of something bigger. I'm a part of something bigger than just what I do with my hands on an instrument. So you kind of present the philosophy, and then only in a one-on-one context would I ever bring up, hey, what if instead of this, we did this? Because when you do it this way, it does this, and when you do it this way, it does this. All that happens one-on-one. I never do that in a group setting. And so that's kind of like the steps. Relationship, big vision, cast philosophy, and then end up with that. Great question, though. Anybody else? Yeah.
Here, and because of that, they don't want to bend a little bit to fit the area they're playing in.
Yeah.
How do you best go about that?
Yeah, that's a great topic too. The question is, what if your musicians are so great that it's actually hard to get them to change? Well, this is where it starts with the leader. So the leader has to exhibit the characteristics of what you're trying to be as someone in ministry. If you wanted to pursue music, you picked the wrong building. That's ultimately true. Like if I wanted to pursue music, I wouldn't even be here. I would be pursuing music. And so sometimes what happens is people get attracted to our churches because we have a stage and it's a medium for them to use their skill. But in the end, that's why I'm always hitting the drum of we are not here to just make music. We're here to usher in the presence of God so that the things that happen in worship happen. That's our goal. And when you focus on the heart of that, it doesn't solve it, but at least it gives you the space where the people are saying to you, like, I don't really get that, or I'm not in on that. Well, now you have a place to talk about it. because it's super important that, yes, everyone, we want you to be excellent, but it's like what I talked about today. The expression is the instrument, but it starts with the heart. God wants your heart, then your expression, not just your expression without the heart. Those things have to go together. So, awesome. Well, thanks, guys. I'm over my time. I want to make sure you guys have enough time to eat lunch. Thank you so much for spending this hour with me, and hope you have a great rest of the day. We'll see you around.